Hi, this is the video on the March on Washington. So the concept of a March on Washington actually preceded 1963. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and civil rights activist, actually threatened a March on Washington to President Roosevelt. He was seeking changes in the policies in terms of segregation in defense industries. And so this really put the pressure on Roosevelt and was quite successful, this threat of a March on Washington. Now, the one that occurs in 1963 on August 28th is actually quite a bit different. It's in a lot of ways trying to support a government program. It's showing support for the potential civil rights bill that's being sort of pushed through Congress in late 1963 and eventually becomes law in 1964. So at this March on Washington, again, we need to focus on the story. There are so many different actors in this, literally actors in some cases, but also musicians, Mahalia Jackson, Joan Baez, and arguably the most famous songwriter in that period, and perhaps in American history, Bob Dylan. So he gives this, plays this song called "Only a Pawn in Their Game," and the song is addressing, just like in chess, when a pawn is the sort of least important piece. Well, they're saying that the Southern politicians, people sort of in powerful positions, were using racism as a way to use the poor whites as their pawn in their game. And so the song is literally kind of addressing the killing of Medgar Evers, the civil rights leader, but that this part of this broader system that's creating this hatred, and it's being not just used for sort of racism, but to hold down poor whites as well, and but to sort of manipulate them through racism. So that was the song that Bob Dylan played. There was also, other than, of course, the "I Have a Dream" speech by Martin Luther King, John Lewis, who was then the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. John Lewis is someone who was involved in sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, and of course later becomes a congressman in Georgia. But John Lewis had an initial speech that was very critical of the pending civil rights bill. But some of the other leaders said, maybe we should tone it down a little bit because we're trying to show support for this. So he still in some ways was somewhat critical and felt that maybe that it was not doing enough to address some of the systemic racism in the nation. So of course, the highlight is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and it is a dynamic, perhaps the greatest speech in American history. But we don't want to miss the point that the story is not really just King. It's about all of these activists that have came from all over the nation and are listening to this speech, but it rings so true to them because many of them have already made tremendous sacrifices. It could be having their son or daughter apply for an integrated school and the dangers that came with that. Some of them really went through a lot, literally just to get there, to find their way to Washington. So as King gives this speech, this very iconic moment in American history, we need to always remember the fact that he gave the speech, but it was the activists, people at historically black colleges, the students that really were the driving force for the sit-in movement, people who had participated in freedom rides, people who had challenged segregation in their cities, and so many of these unheralded activists. So there were people like A. Philip Randolph, who maybe some Americans have heard of, but probably not the majority. A. Philip Randolph, Ella Baker, people like this who are fairly well known in civil rights circles that had done so much to sort of create this moment in a lot of ways. But we can't forget about the unheralded activists, let's say the David Forbes of Raleigh, the Ezell Blair Jr. in Greensboro of the Greensboro Four. These people that really had made these changes. So in essence, that King had given this tremendous speech, but those unheralded activists had prepared the stage.